Hey engineers, today we are going to talk about submarines. When I think of submarines, I get a little bit nervous because I have something called claustrophobia, which is the fear of being in a confined or a tight spot. Have you ever seen the inside of a submarine before? When we think of boats, typically we think of the boats that stay on the top of the water. Submarines are different because they go below the surface of the water. They actually have two jobs that they do. They go down, they dive, and then they resurface or they come back up above the water. They also have to keep all the things inside, including the people, dry. For this week's STEM challenge, you are going to create a submarine, and we're going to focus on the diving part. Submarines dive or they sink because they're heavier or more dense than the water around them. It's the opposite of the boats that stay up above. Let's learn more about submarines.
Submarines work because of the way things sink and float, and some really smart thinking. You probably know that when you put things in water, some of them float to the top and some of them sink to the bottom. We learned that whether something floats depends on its density or how heavy it is for its size. If it's heavier for its size than water, it sinks. If it's lighter, it floats. For example, a plastic spoon isn't very heavy for its size, so it floats. But a metal spoon is pretty heavy for its size, so it sinks. That's how boats float too. They're really heavy. You wouldn't be able to just pick one up, but they're not actually very heavy compared to how big they are. They're not very dense, so they float. And submarines can float on top of the water for the same reason. But for a submarine to be able to go under the water, it needs some of that really smart thinking I mentioned earlier. To dive into the water, a submarine needs to become heavier for its size. It needs to be more dense. But it's not so easy to make something heavier when you're in the middle of the ocean. That's why submarines have big tanks called ballast tanks. When it's time for the submarine to dive down, the ballast tanks open up so they fill with water. Adding the weight of the water to the submarine makes it dense enough to sink. You can see how this works if you have an empty bottle or jar and a bowl of water. At first, if you put the bottle or jar in the water, it will float because the only thing inside it is air. It's very light for its size, so it's not very dense. But if you take the cap off and let the water in from the bowl, it will sink. The water makes it heavier for its size, just like putting water into the ballast tanks on a submarine does. The rest of the submarine is very strong and sealed up tight, so water can't get in, and so that if there are people on the submarine, they can breathe. To make sure they don't run out of air, they bring along extra air that's all squeezed together inside a bottle, like how you squeeze air into a bicycle tire when you pump it up. And then they can go exploring under the water. But after the submarine is done exploring under the water, there's one more thing it needs to be able to do. Maybe you already guessed what it is. We know how submarines dive under the water, but how do they get back up? Well, remember how submarines bring along extra air? If there are people on the submarine, they can use it to breathe, but it's not only for breathing. When it's time for the submarine to go back up to the surface, it pushes air into the ballast tanks and water out. That makes the submarine lighter for its size, so it can float up to the top of the water.
Your STEM challenge this week is to create a submarine that does two things. One, keeps a toy dry on the inside, and two, dives or sinks. Let's take a look at your directions. For the Build a Submarine challenge, you are to design and construct a submarine that sinks and keeps the inside dry. For the materials, you can use an animal or toy figurine, plastic wrap, Legos, rocks, foil, cubes, or any type of materials that you can think of that would be useful in your constructing. For my materials, I'm going to use plastic cubes, some rocks, plastic wrap, foil, duct tape, scissors, and I'm going to keep a little toy turtle dry. Okay, so my submarine, I got a little carried away. I've got the cubes in there, I put rocks, around the outside of the cubes, the turtle's in there, there's the plastic wrap, there's the foil. I don't know if we'll get the turtle back out to even see if he stays dry, but I filled up the sink and let's test it out. All right, let's see if this submarine dives to the ocean floor. Oh man. Now I need to go make some modifications. If you're ready for an extra challenge, if you can get your submarine to dive, can you get it to resurface or come back up? That's for the extra challenge. We are super excited to see your submarines.